So this is one of a series of webinars which are focused on supporting the needs of children who are refugees. We know that many schools have had less experience in receiving children who are new to English, so it's great that schools are reaching out and finding CPD. We know that this very distinct context in terms of receiving refugees, particularly now from Ukraine, is driving schools to look at their EAL provision more broadly. And I'll be signposting other training and guidance that's available from the Bell Foundation, which your school might be interested in following this. So before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to briefly explain the structure of this webinar. We'll explore practical ways in which secondary teachers and teaching assistants can create a learning environment which is socially, academically and linguistically inclusive. First, Emily will consider the importance of collating and sharing information about new arrivals and how mainstream education can make such a significant impact. Then, Sarah will go on to look more closely at academic inclusion, supporting learners with the learning process and parental engagement. If there's time at the end, Sarah and Emily will take any questions that you may have, so please do feel free to use the Q&A box to send any questions to the presenters, and we'll pose those at the end. Tomorrow, as I've mentioned, you'll receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar, together with all of the links that will be shared. Enough of me now. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our two presenters today, Emily and Sarah. Emily Curran joined the Bell Foundation as a trainer in September 2018. Prior to joining the Bell Foundation, Emily worked in English language teaching and taught both adults and young learners in the UK and Thailand respectively, before going on to become a teacher trainer in the ELT sector. Emily has a CELTA and Delta and has also worked closely with Cambridge Refugee Resettlement Campaign as a liaison for the English language provision. Sarah Moody joined the Bell Foundation in February 2021 as a trainer. Her ELT experience spans more than 30 decades and includes English as a foreign language, English as an additional language, and English for academic purposes, as well as managing and leading the EAL team on the island of Jersey. She has been a mainstream teacher of secondary English and drama, as well as an EAL teacher working for schools and local authorities, and as such has taught pupils and students aged from 5 to 65. She holds a TESOL Specialist PGCE, a postgraduate diploma in language and literacy teaching, and an MA in applied linguistics. I'll hand you over to Emily.
Thanks, Caroline. And welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I can see there's a lot of people here from all over the place, so really nice to see you all here with us today. So I'm going to start just by looking at our learning intentions for the webinar. So in this session, we're going to consider challenges commonly faced by newly arrived children from a refugee background, and consider a range of resources, strategies and ideas that promote social, academic and linguistic inclusion for newly arrived learners that have a refugee background. And that's so that you feel more informed about social, linguistic and academic support for newly arrived children who are refugees, especially in terms of planning EAL-friendly lessons. And ultimately so that children from a refugee background feel included and supported, especially with their language development. So first, we're going to look at the superdiversity of learners who come from a refugee background. The UNHCR say that for most refugee, asylum seeking and stateless children, attending school is one of the most important things they can do to return to normality after being displaced. With that in mind, I thought we could take a moment to really get into the shoes of our learners who arrive into our schools and consider what might be worrying them. So what might be a barrier for them settling and making the most of their education in the UK? So first, we're going to think just about a new student who's arrived from a school elsewhere in the UK. So not migrant or refugee children, just another child elsewhere in the UK. So I'd like you to write in the chat box, if you were that child and you're coming to a new school, what might your worries be? So you've got making friends, not understanding people, new routines, friends, sets, new area, friends, not fitting in, finding my way around, understanding the social groups, being included, asking for teacher expectations, new environment. Okay. Yeah, so a lot of common themes there. Thank you. And then we're going to think about if you were a migrant child coming to the UK, again, not necessarily a refugee at this point, just a child coming to a UK school, what additional worries might you have? So for example, they might be thinking, will school be different? So if I could just ask you to pop those ideas in the chat box as well. Okay, first 3, 4 people saying language barriers, cultural differences, absolutely racism, family, equipment, rules, accent, understanding the lessons, uniform. Yeah, exactly. Super. Thanks for that. And then we're going to think finally about children who are from a refugee background. So what additional worries on top of those worries of being a new student and being a migrant might a child who's a refugee be worrying about as well? Will they understand worries about family back home, trauma, will I be safe, bereavement, can I go back to my country? Worries about a family at home, language barrier again, what's going on at home, absolutely. Yeah, so a lot of concerns around safety, family. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for your contributions. Some really common themes there, and obviously children are all different. For many children there'll be great excitement about starting a new school, so new opportunities, friends, new subjects, new languages. But of course, it's very normal for teachers and teaching staff to think about the aspects of a child's life that will be more stressful or present as a challenge. So we've got these worries and the worries that you suggested for children starting a new school from elsewhere in the UK. So a child who's new to English and arrives to the UK as a migrant then has all these additional concerns. So their parents might have moved, perhaps, for example, because they're studying at university. And they'll be faced with these challenges, including a new education system, teaching styles, and challenges of accessing education in a new language, which you picked up on. And then obviously on top of all these challenges, we've got children seeking a refuge in the UK, and they'll also have very real worries about family and friends back in their home country. So in terms of addressing these needs, schools already have well-developed pastoral system that support children arriving from other schools in the UK, so the orange ones we can see on the slide. And that's an area that schools are already experts in and will serve you well in meeting the needs of refugees. And the concerns that are specific to those seeking refuge include needs around trauma and the rights of refugees, which we mentioned. And much of the focus on welcoming refugees centres around these areas, and rightly so, to ensure that families who are dealing with abrupt and major changes feel safe, welcome and supported. So this afternoon, we're going to be thinking in particular about language support, but we're aware that there is crossover between wellbeing, language development and academic achievement. So the Education Policy Institute published a report in December which looks at the educational outcomes of refugees, which is an area lacking in research. The report revealed that unaccompanied asylum-seeking children are a highly vulnerable group within secondary schools with very low attainment, even by comparison with other vulnerable groups of pupils, and experiencing higher than average rates of school absence and fixed period exclusions. So we can see on the slide here that there was a considerable gap in attainment between unaccompanied asylum-seeking pupils and non-migrant children of 37.4 months. And refugee and asylum support children, however, the research showed fare better with low estimated rates of absences and exclusions. But in spite of these possible educational advantages, they're still subject to low GCSE attainment, comparable with that of other highly vulnerable groups, such as persistently disadvantaged pupils. So I'll just give you a second to read that second quote on the slide there. So this is part of the reason why we're here today, to think about how to reduce these gaps in attainment so that learners who are refugees can reach their potential. And it would be tempting to look at that data from EPI and assume that there's merit in a one-size-fits-all support package for all children who are refugees. But like all children we work with, children who arrive seeking refuge are a heterogeneous group. And a useful way of considering some of the factors impacting on refugees is to consider their experiences before leaving their country, home country, during the journey, and also different experiences on arrival. And I'll briefly consider those in a moment. But these diverse groups who fall under the label refugee or asylum seeker have a huge range of strengths and needs, and it will be vital that schools get to know their new children and their families. So one thing that all groups possess, however, are rich, meaningful cultural backgrounds and different types of knowledge from diverse histories and experiences. And even if a child arrives speaking no English at all, they'll have some knowledge of their own language or languages, and this is likely to prove their greatest asset from which teachers can build. So in terms of different experiences prior to arrival, children are likely to have had very different experiences. So for example, they may have witnessed violence and death, including potentially that of a family member, or they may have experienced separation from family members. They may have experienced fear and uncertainty, and also that of their parents. And they'll almost certainly have experienced disruption to school, to normal life, such as healthcare, education, and availability of everyday essentials such as food, water, and fuel. Some children may have had significant disruption to their education, and so their subject knowledge may not be where we expect. The experiences and schooling of each child will be different. So some children might have been homeschooled by a neighbour, for example, or perhaps a family friend. But others might not be literate in their home language. And some children might not have attended school in their home country at all for one reason or another. So very varied experiences there. In terms of transmigration, children may have travelled in different ways, directly by an organised flight, or a long difficult journey through several countries, possibly in the hands of traffickers, and possibly separated from family members. They may have spent a long periods of time in refugee camps, or have spent time living in another country. And in all of those places, they may have had other experiences of education and language learning. In terms of post-migration, children might have different experiences of the asylum process. They might arrive to a settled long-term home, or to a short-term accommodation, which will mean more upheaval, or even to nothing at all. Children might also be experiencing isolation, confusion, stress, and their families may have experienced a loss of status and income as a result of arriving in a new country. As well as this, some families will be facing a complicated asylum process and a complicated process for getting a school place, accessing healthcare, and so on. Some families will arrive and be part of an established community, whereas other families will arrive in isolation and may end up living in more remote areas with less access to support, including language support. So bearing this diversity in mind then, let's take a moment to look at these two fictional characters, fictional based on real similar cases. So we have Leah. She is a 12-year-old student from Ukraine, and she was engaged with full schooling until last year. She studied English previously for 2 years and has arrived in the UK with her mother and younger sister, but has been separated from her father. She's very withdrawn at present, refusing to participate in drama, PE, and speaking activities. She speaks Ukrainian with age-appropriate literacy, and she also understands some Russian. And then we have Jonas, a 15-year-old boy from Eritrea, who is an unaccompanied asylum seeker housed with a foster family. He's experienced disrupted former schooling, including periods in camps. He speaks Tigrinya and Arabic and can read and write a little bit in Arabic. He's new to English, but he's very keen and he studies hard, and he's very ambitious and he wants to be a paramedic. So as we can see, they're very different children in terms of age, language and life experiences. But what they have in common is that they both have been forced to flee their own countries and have just arrived at secondary school in the UK. So we're going to look at good practice in terms of social and academic support, and examine how this works in place for these particular case study children later on in the webinar. So before we go on to do that, we're going to take a moment to look at what information is really key to collect when a child from a refugee background starts school in the UK. Okay, so we can see the importance of not generalizing about a child who's a refugee, as the label tells us very little. And so it will be important then to gather as much relevant information as possible, but remembering to be sensitive, because we don't, for example, need to ask about traumatic experiences. So ideally, one way to gather as much useful information for the school and at the same time provide a supportive welcome for the child and their family is to have a meeting and a tour of the school before the child starts. It's useful to have an interpreter for this tour of the school. If possible, professional interpreters would be great, but it may also be possible to use a member of the community where large numbers of refugees have arrived in an area together. And that would be a great opportunity to empower members of the community who want to be more involved in supporting their own community to settle. Useful at this stage also to anticipate any documentation that would be necessary to complete so that the interpreter can support with this. So you can take that with you to that initial tour while the interpreter's there. And during the tour of the school, you can also introduce key staff and children that will be working with the newly arrived pupil, just so that they have an idea of who to go to on their first day. It's also important to share translated information about the curriculum, but we can't assume that families will already know this information. And wherever possible, provide translated printed versions of this key information about the school, things such as start times, expectations of the school, and so on, so that families can refer back to it. And you might also want to share information about the UK education system. The Bell Foundation has a document on this that has been translated into a number of different languages, including Dari, Arabic, and Ukrainian, and that's available on the Bell Foundation website. It's also, during the tour of the school, a useful time to organise practical elements, so find out about uniform and any other potential expenses. And also a good time to find out key information about the learner and start getting to know them as an individual. And in doing so, creating a positive relationship with the family, showing that you're genuinely interested. So in terms of practical things to do before meeting with the parents, it's also worth finding out if home language teaching support staff are available, or if there's any support on offer from local authorities, academy chains, or charities. There is an EAL factor included in the national funding formula, which means that schools should receive additional funding for a pupil who uses EAL for the first 3 years after a child is recorded on the October census. The funding follows a child if they move school, and although the funding is not ring-fenced, it should be used to provide English language support, whether that's through the use of TAs, interpreters, or so on. It's also worth finding out if there are any relevant supplementary schools or cultural centres that can support the learners, especially in maintaining their home language and potentially accessing the curriculum in their home language. Particularly important if the learner or the learner's family plan to return to their home country at some point, because then they can continue to keep up with that content in their home language. There may also be local refugee support organisations who can support newly arrived families in a number of ways. So getting the contact details for these in advance might be really helpful, not only in practical terms, but also perhaps as a way of finding a community. And lastly, consider if there's any counselling available for both the children, families, and to support staff at school. Okay, so coming back to the pupil profile now, we're going to have a think about what kind of information it might be useful to find out from the family, carers, or the child themselves. So in the initial interview with the family and the newly arrived learner, it's good to find out as much as possible, including how to pronounce and write the child's name correctly. It seems like a small thing to get right, but it can make a really big difference. And I think we sometimes get a bit self-conscious about not wanting to ask too much, but it's much better to ask and get it right than it is to keep repeating somebody's name wrong, because we all know what it's like for somebody to pronounce our name wrong, and it doesn't feel very nice. And I think especially at this stage where learners want to feel as included as possible, really important, simple thing to do. There's also a useful guide called Getting It Right. It's a reference guide for registering students with non-English names, and that explains, for example, how first and last names work and transfer in different countries. So, for example, my last name is my father's last name, but in some countries it may be that the father's middle name becomes the child's last name. So obviously, first point of call is to talk to the family and the child, but if you're not sure and you want to read up a bit in advance, you might want to have a look at this. And I think Caroline will send a link in the chat box in a moment. It's also important to find out about prior schooling, including any favourite subjects of the learner and any previous qualifications. This can be useful especially for learners who are arriving in Key Stage 4 because they might have been preparing to take exams in their own country. So if you find out which exams they were entering, you might be able to offer them the same subjects. And local community language support groups might also be able to help in this area. In terms of an official proficiency in English assessment, we recommend waiting at least 3 or more weeks, as it gives the learner time to settle in, feel safe, and therefore be able to accurately demonstrate what they know and can do in English. But at the initial meeting, you might be able to get a broad idea of where the learner is with their English language development, so that you're ready to put in some support on the first day. And as well as this, it's worth finding out about the various languages and literacies that the child and family use. So for example, some learners or family members may speak more than one language, but they may not be literate in all of the languages that they speak. Or they might have good social English, but their reading and writing in English may be less developed. It's also worth finding out about the learners and families' computer literacy, so you can ensure support is given in terms of not only equipment, but also perhaps training and adjusting expectations in terms of what learners can do with computers. And finding out about the learner's home situation can help you to understand the type of provision that they have for learning at home, and hopefully better understand their needs as an individual. So for example, you might want to find out who the learner is living with, if there's a family member or caregiver who speaks English that can serve as a primary point of contact, if they're living in a permanent or temporary accommodation, or if the learner has any responsibilities, such as caring for younger siblings or relatives. And of course, it's important to be really sensitive here, as you don't want or need to bring up anything traumatic. So avoid asking questions about how they came to the UK or what happened to other members of their family. And of course, find out about their religious observances, dietary needs, and their favourite sports, hobbies and interests. It's also just worth being aware that refugee families might have had negative experiences of being questioned by authorities in the past. So they might find lots of questions at this sort of meeting a bit confrontational, or may not be as willing to answer questions as you may have thought. So just worth bearing that in mind, and to reassure them that you're there to help them and their children as well. So once you've gathered all this information for your pupil profile, important to share it with subject teachers and other support staff that might be working with the learner, so that they can support them appropriately. Southeast Grid for Learning has developed an online background collation tool for new arrivals, which enables you to gather information in a range of languages. It includes languages spoken by some refugees, such as Arabic and Albanian, and they're also in the process of adding Ukrainian as well. I think Caroline's going to put the link in the chat. And you may also be interested in the Cubex tool, which gathers background information on learners in a number of languages. But this tool is currently in its trial phase. So if you already have a system on collecting this kind of information already in place, you might be interested in trying this tool out and see how it compares, but maybe not the best tool to use if you don't have something in place already. And just to flag that in the webinar today, we're going to go on to look at social and academic inclusion. But I wanted to signpost how important it is to consider the effects of stress and trauma on children who are refugees, as this is obviously something that will clearly affect a child's ability to learn and feel settled in a school. And today we're focusing primarily on language support, and are very aware that we're not the experts on stress and trauma. So would strongly recommend that you read up on that. And one thing that I found particularly informative is this UNHCR guidance around stress and trauma. It explains how stress and trauma affect a child, their ability to learn, how that manifests in behaviour, and it outlines what teachers can do to support the children in class as well. So a really useful document. Okay, we're going to go on to look at mainstreaming briefly. So look at the value of including learners in mainstream classes. So for the most part, children who are newly arrived will benefit from joining mainstream lessons as soon as possible. Michael Evans et al. Elaborate on this in their book, Towards an Inclusive Pedagogy for EAL in the Multilingual Classroom. Because at its simplest, in the classroom with their peers is the best place for social, academic and linguistic inclusion. In terms of social inclusion, classroom learning with opportunities for collaboration and discussion are an excellent means of fostering relationships and friendships between learners. And the aim is for a child to feel as settled and involved as possible. Joining mainstream classes early can help learners to bond with their first language English peers more quickly. Joining mainstream lessons early also helps promote academic inclusion, as it means that learners don't lose optimal opportunity for subject matter learning. The classroom teacher is the best source of academic learning, as they are the subject experts. And lastly, mainstream lessons provide linguistic inclusion, in that different teachers and different children will provide models of all the varieties of English from which newly arrived learners will benefit. New arrivals, refugees or otherwise, offer great advantages to the classroom, such as their unique cultural heritage. Including and welcoming refugees into mainstream classes can also be hugely beneficial for non-refugee children, as it can encourage empathy and understanding. So you might want to raise awareness within your classes of the refugee experience for the non-refugee children. And UNHCR once again have a guide with some activities in it which you might be interested in dipping into if you want to follow that up. And a note on out of class support was, we understand that there might be a case for withdrawal lessons for children who are new to English, who have complex strengths and needs. So for example, some learners might not be literate because of disrupted schooling and therefore need additional literacy support. We would say if withdrawal does need to take place, then it's most effective if it's time limited and curriculum focused. We understand that for learners who are new to English, there may be some need to focus on survival language at the start, but it's important that that doesn't happen at the expense of curriculum learning. So it might be about finding a balance between survival language and curriculum support. And one approach can be to use withdrawal sessions to equip learners with the language needed for upcoming curriculum lessons. So for example, you might take a learner out of class and prepare them for a science lesson by helping them understand the use of present simple to present scientific facts, so that later in the week when they attend that science lesson, they're able to access that language of that class more easily. It's also worth thinking carefully about what lessons students are being taken out of, and we avoid withdrawal from core subjects. And one approach for withdrawal classes could be that learners who are late arrivals, so for example, arriving Key Stage 4, might want to do one less GCSE, although not in core subjects. and instead use this time for curriculum-focused English language support. Okay, so we're going to move on now to look at social inclusion, which is crucial in helping learners feel safe and secure in their new school, especially for children who come from a refugee background. Social inclusion also plays an important role in helping learners develop their English language skills, as much language development takes place through social interactions. And in this section, we'll be talking about the importance of buddies, extracurricular activities, conversation clubs, and providing a safe space. So setting up a buddying scheme can really help with social inclusion. Buddies can make up part of a support network for the new child, and they understand the school from a child's perspective, which is invaluable for newly arrived children. Buddies can be assigned to newly arrived children, including those seeking refuge, before school starts, and ideally they would meet them before their first day so that when the new arrival starts school, they know who to turn to and they can see a familiar face. Buddies work best when there are a small group of carefully selected buddies for each new arrival. These buddies will need to be kind and empathetic and should provide a positive role model in terms of both English language modelling and expectations around behaviour. Ideally, wherever possible, at least one of the buddies might also share the same language as the new arrival. And it's preferable to work with a selection of buddies, as it means that the learner has more than one person to go to and might go to different buddies for different things. It also ensures that it doesn't become too overwhelming for the buddies, as the responsibility is shared out amongst them. It's for this reason that it's also really useful to ensure that buddies have a teacher or adult in the school that they can check in with regularly, both in terms of their own well-being and in terms of the well-being of the new arrival. One such scheme that does buddying particularly well is the Young Interpreter Scheme from Hampshire MTAS. So interested children who are speakers of other languages, along with monolingual English speakers who are proud of their school and want to help new arrivals. They're trained to interpret using the home language or accessible English. And obviously they can't deal with sensitive information, but they're able to show the new arrival around, answer their questions, and provide a friendly face at a stressful time. And other extracurricular activities can also be a great way to ensure new children are included socially. So things like sports clubs, arts clubs, community gardening, and other interests of the learners. And they give learners an opportunity to connect with other children in a structured way that still lets them be creative. Art and gardening, for example, can be very therapeutic, and a sports club allows a learner to release stress in a healthy physical way. It's also worth being aware of any costs tied up with extracurricular activities such as football kits, and as learners might need support in accessing these. And a note on sporting activities to be mindful of changing arrangements. So children might have scars or be sensitive about particular parts of their bodies due to trauma. So you may want to consider if there are separate changing areas or perhaps a way for the child to arrive already changed. Conversation clubs are great for improving social English and social inclusion. They could be run like cafes, with learners sitting at tables, with volunteers and talking. So you might want to provide prompts, conversation prompts, an activity like a board game or jigsaw puzzle. And volunteers could be peers, older pupils, or possibly volunteers from outside the school, such as university students. It's also worth bearing in mind that lunch and break times can be really stressful. There's a lot of noise moving around and they're less structured. So it could be useful then for students to know there's a safe space that they can go to during these times. Lots of schools already have obviously such initiatives in operation, so it might just be simply a case of introducing the new learner and make sure they've got the necessary passes. This could be a tutor room, a room already designated as a safe space or quiet space. A conversation cafe, which we just saw, could also be another example of a safe space which could be provided at lunchtime. And once again, useful to make sure that the student knows where these places are before they arrive on their first day. And I'm going to pass over to Sarah now, who'll be picking up and talking about academic inclusion and working with parents and carers.
Hi everybody, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hi everyone, and thanks for coming. So having looked at social inclusion, now we're going to think about how to include your learners with EAL academically. We're going to consider principles of EAL pedagogy, special consideration for learners joining at Key Stage 4, and some strategies you can use in class which reflect these. So start with a quote. On the 4th of May, the Secretary of State for Education, Nadim Sawi, published a letter to schools and local authorities regarding people fleeing Ukraine. In the letter, he wrote that schools are responsible for ensuring that all their pupils who have a language other than English develop the English language skills necessary in order to achieve their full potential. So we're going to be looking at specific strategies and ideas that you can use for that exact purpose. Firstly, if you think about it, learners using English as an additional language have a double job to do. They have to practice and become fluent in demonstrating their subject knowledge in order to gain an education and pass their exams, but they must also practice and become fluent in the language needed to demonstrate that subject knowledge in the system they're in, which in this case is English. This means that teachers, whatever their subject, have a double job to do too, teaching the English language as well as their curriculum subjects. Therefore, it's not enough just to teach English in an English as a foreign language or a modern foreign language sort of way, presenting vocabulary and structure in a linear, logical fashion, like where you probably move from a present to past tenses, for example, or from simple to complex sentences. Maybe this is happening in your time-limited interventions alongside the rest of the curriculum, but it's not enough. It may well be helpful, but it's not enough, because in lessons, the learner is acquiring English from all directions in a messy, organic kind of way. Perhaps, for example, they might need to use present tenses for describing the course of a river in geography, or then a mixture of past and present discussing characters in Macbeth, and then perhaps some futures making predictions in a maths or a science lesson, all this in one morning and each with its own lexical subset of vocabulary. Therefore, the teachers of those subjects need to take steps as well to help the learner acquire the language they need in a meaningful way in context. When thinking about academic inclusion, we need to consider three underpinning principles of EAL pedagogy. Firstly, that plurilingualism is an asset. The ability to use more than one language is a skill which pupils using EAL bring with them, whether they're new to English or not. Learners actively use the languages they already know to learn English. And so the languages they already know are the most valuable resource that they have to draw upon in the acquisition of both subject knowledge and their additional languages. Secondly, the cognitive challenge of the lesson can and should be kept appropriately high. Learners need exposure to high quality curriculum content, not a watered down or dumbed down curriculum. And thirdly, that language acquisition goes hand in hand with cognitive development. As we said before, learners using EAL have a double job to do, learning the English language and at the same time learning the curriculum content. So children will have arrived with a knowledge of language, and it's that knowledge of words and concepts and that feel for how a language works, which will help them to learn a new one. Polyglots, people who speak loads of languages, always say that the more languages they know, the more easily they learn the next one. So language skills are transferable. Anything that a learner knows how to say or write in one language, they can potentially learn to express in another. Depending on how much schooling they've received, EL learners will already have some curriculum knowledge, which they've learned through their other language, and which they now need to be able just to transfer to English. So the learner's first language is the most important tool that they have with them. Therefore, it's important not to see EL learners as blank slates or to apply a deficit model and see them as lacking English, but rather to welcome them as rich resources who are already linguistically proficient. Of course, on top of that, a person's language is integral to their identity, their connection with family, and their heritage in their community. So rejecting a child's language, which I hope we'd never do, is essentially to reject the child. So speaking other languages is an asset. So as a school, as a teacher, take an asset-based approach. Incorporate other languages, incorporate multilingualism into the culture of your school or your classroom. This should start clearly with an active language policy, but what does it look like in practice? Well, in practice, walking through a school, it might look like signs and classroom displays which show that a variety of languages are in active daily use. Books in a range of languages in the library, well thumbed. Groups of young interpreters who are active and high profile. Perhaps they have their own notice board and their own welcome area in the school reception space. What can it sound like? Well, it can sound like children using their languages in classrooms, in corridors, in playgrounds, with pride and confidence in both academic and social situations. It can sound like music from many cultures being part of assemblies and celebrations. It can sound like staff greeting children in different languages, perhaps parents coming in to give talks or to help with first language literacy, and visiting teachers coming in to help students prepare for their first language GCSEs. If schools truly buy into the idea that knowledge of languages other than English is an asset, then they will encourage children to draw on this knowledge and weave it into their play, their socialising and their learning. And this will lead in turn to an enriched and dynamic and vibrant school environment. On top of that, there's plenty of research to show that proficiency in more than one language leads to better academic outcomes. So that will become reflected in the school's results too. I'm going to talk a little bit about translanguaging. A translanguaging approach in the classroom means that learners can harness their prior knowledge. It's a pedagogical approach in which learners intentionally use the full repertoire of languages at their disposal in an activity or a series activity in order to maximise their output and maximise the learning. So what does that mean? Well, it might look like a learner writing in their first language and then translating it, or writing perhaps a more complex story in their first language because they can do that more easily, but using that then to construct something much simpler in English. It could be that they label a diagram bilingually, or it could be that they take notes in their first language and then use these notes to ensure the final output is in English. It might sound like learners having an animated discussion about, for example, Lady Macbeth's motivation in one language, and then feeding back to the class in another. It might sound like a bilingual member of staff talking a student through the process of working out ratios in a maths lesson. All that translanguaging. Thinking about our case studies, it might be that Leah looks at flashcards about river erosion and discusses them in her first language with a small group of Ukrainian speakers, and then uses a substitution table to write correct sentences in English. Perhaps Jonas is able to use a translation app to hear some key words for science topics spoken in Arabic, and then use that to compile his own bilingual glossary using 2 languages, which he can later refer to in class. So how do you find activities which use the first languages? Well, TED.com's got lots of talks on a number of academic topics. It's easily searchable and it's in dozens of languages. What you do is you find a video you want to use, you go to settings, subtitles, and then you can choose your language. And you can also print out the transcripts, which is useful. As long as students are literate in their first language, then listening to the talk in English while reading the subtitles in their home language will help the new arrival understand the content at the same time as being exposed to the subject-specific English. For example, on TED.com at the moment, there's a video about plastics where the subtitles have been set in Ukrainian. So if Leah's class were watching this in a science lesson, she would be fully able to access the curriculum content by watching the subtitles. She could then learn some keywords in English using flashcards or a word mat and a translating app, and she could then go on to complete some version of whatever written work the class was doing, either by writing in Ukrainian and then translating it, or by completing some kind of scaffolding writing, such as a gap fill activity or sentence stems in English. Khan Academy is another useful resource. There are lessons on a vast number of curriculum topics. They're provided in over 50 languages, and many others have subtitles translated into other languages. If you watch a video prior to the lesson, it can help with the understanding of the topic, or the subtitles can be turned on while the class watches it in English. There's some content available in Ukrainian and there's some in Arabic. So our 2 case studies, Leah and Jonas, could use Khan Academy to watch curriculum content videos in their first language as a piece of pre-teaching in preparation for a lesson, as a piece of homework, or as a piece of consolidation to make sure they understood after a lesson. And I haven't got a slide on this, but Wikipedia is also available in different languages via the drop-down menu. So there's another tool you might want to consider. If you're able to, it's a great idea to source textbooks in your learner's first language so they can read about the curriculum topic in their first language before engaging with their class in English. Community language schools may be able to help with these resources, and there's a lot available online as well. They could read about the topic in their first language for homework or in the first 5 minutes of a lesson. And it's true, you have to bear in mind that some curriculum areas like history or literature might differ substantially country to country, but many topics from science and maths, for example, are completely possible to find in this way. Students from Ukraine still have access to online learning from their own government, and we'll send you the link to that in case you don't already have it. But students who are planning to return to their own country and education system often wish to keep abreast of their learning in their own systems so that they're not behind when they go back. And although we're aware that plans can change and they may end up staying longer than they think, some schools in the UK are offering Ukrainian students the facility to do some of this online learning at school. This can be done by making computer suites available after school or at lunchtime, for example. You, as a teacher, can facilitate learning through translanguaging by building a secure environment in your school or class where using other languages is viewed as normal as well as an asset, and this gives a positive message to all students. You can do this through seating plans, through setting tasks where using another language is an asset, and by careful groupings and pairings of your learners. So, for example, you could group learners of one home language together, and this is useful where the focus is on learning new content, as it will allow them to discuss it in their first language, or you can use mixed language groups or trios. And this is useful, especially as I've done in this fictional task here, the learner with EAL has just been catapulted into the role of experts. On other occasions, you may want to pair new to English learner with more proficient speakers of English who share their first language, or with friendly first language English speakers. Of course, I'm aware that in lots of classes and schools, there'll be isolated learners, like maybe just one learner who speaks Dari. And in these cases, it becomes all about the use of bilingual materials, translation technology where it's appropriate, and grouping the child with sympathetic first language speakers. So in order to keep the cognitive challenge high, it's useful to be able to assess what prior knowledge the student brings with them. Newly arrived students at secondary level always bring with them some subject relevant expertise. Some students, such as our case study Leah, who's had full schooling in Ukraine, may already know, for example, how plant and animal cells differ. And so when she encounters that subject in science, for her, the learning will be just about the language needed to explain this and less about the concepts. Lots of learning is transferable. For example, an understanding of the impact of coastal erosion in one country is likely to be similar to study of the same thing in the UK. But assessing the prior knowledge of learners who are new to English can be difficult. Sometimes it's possible to have these discussions about prior experience during the initial visit to the school, especially if there's an interpreter. Sometimes previous school reports are available. And staff who speak the same language, if you have them available, or otherwise professional interpreters can be very helpful here too. If first language speakers aren't available, which is sometimes the case, then making use of technology to support translating short statements, and then maybe asking students to do a simple RAG rating activity to say how confident they feel about different subjects might give you an idea about prior learning. And the findings from these kinds of things you can then use to inform the content in any intervention sessions that you're running or homework. So in order to keep the cognitive challenge high, you will want to use lots of visual materials, and one example of that is flashcards. Flashcards have many uses and they're quite simple to source or make, and there are lots on the Bell Foundation website, including these. The most obvious use they have is to learn, practice and revise vocabulary. It's not difficult to see how either Jonas or Leah could make use of these flashcards in a geography lesson. The words and images from flashcards can be used as a stimulus, for example, to tell a story, or they can be used to sequence events in the text or sequence a process. They demonstrate knowledge and they allow the learner the opportunity to practice speaking through the retelling of a sequence. They can also be used in games like bingo, either as a whole class revision or consolidation activity or as a pre-teaching or intervention activity. There's also Quizlet, if you've heard of that, which provides a good source of online flashcards. Another way of keeping the cognitive challenge high is substitution tables, which are a great way to scaffold language whilst keeping the cognitive level high. They provide grammar and vocabulary structure that learners can use and repeat, thus improving and consolidating their knowledge about the English language and enabling them to produce accurate sentences, even when they're quite new to English. This example, for example, would enable relatively new to English learners to produce sentences about cell types. These kind of tables can be made with words only, a mixture of pictures and words, and with or without translations. Collaborative learning activities, including information gaps and information exchange, are a great way of marrying language acquisition and subject learning. In an activity like this one, each learner or pair of learners would have some information. In this case, it's about a character in Macbeth, but obviously it's adaptable. They have some information, they also lack some information, and they have to find it out from other learners. So they have to ask and answer questions, or they have to sit together and compare their information somehow in order to complete the task. Leah and Jonas could benefit from activities like this as part of a pair or part of a small group. They would gain some curriculum knowledge, they would gain a real sense of being involved with the class, and they'd gain a lot of practice in either asking and answering questions, or maybe, if they're not ready to do that, practice in listening to others doing that. So this is a good example of language acquisition going hand in hand with subject content learning. Having said that, as we look at these inclusive strategies, it's worth reminding ourselves that this kind of pedagogy might be very new to lots of EAL learners, including those seeking sanctuary, who might be finding UK schools quite different from their previous environments and educational settings. So they might not be used to working in pairs and groups, or they might not be used to talking very much in class, or to not facing the front. So if they're reluctant to participate at first, be patient and model the approach. Let them watch other people doing it first. A student such as our case study, Leah, who's unwilling to participate in activities which make her feel vulnerable at the moment, maybe at the beginning she could be allowed to be a silent participant as her confidence builds. Another way of combining language acquisition with subject content is to use activities designed to support reading for meaning. So rather than check for overall understanding of a text, which assumes fluency in a language, these activities focus on the meaning of individual words or phrases, or perhaps even paragraph. The Bell Foundation website, again, has a large number of these activities. They focus on one aspect of language or grammatical structure at a time. For instance, in the screenshot from our activity about Macbeth here, it's the word because, which is focused on. And then the learners have to link the two halves to create meaningful and correct sentences. So if Leah or Jonas have become familiar with the story of Macbeth through the activities like the previous one, then they could use this resource to make sentences about it which are correct grammatically and in terms of subject knowledge. Dictogloss is a modelling activity especially good for secondary learners and especially good for those approaching exam time. And it works like this. Having pre-taught some vocabulary and set the scene, perhaps using a visual activity such as the one on the left here, the teacher then reads the short text on the right twice. On the second reading, students take notes. Students can't see the text. On the second reading, they take notes. They then compare their notes in pairs or threes. The teacher reads it again, and then they try to reconstruct the text exactly as it was spoken. Finally, it's read for the last time, and students have a set time to try and redraft their texts before comparing it to the original. So this can be adapted to model, for example, introductory or concluding paragraphs for English essays, or it's very good for 6 points exam answers in science papers. If students like Jonas and Leah are not able to attempt this at first, they could be given a closed version of the text with gaps to fill in, or they could be given copies with sections missing that they have to fill in. But this activity has benefits to the whole class, not just the EAL learner, because it integrates speaking, listening, reading and writing, as well as modelling and redrafting academic language. So this is an example. This time it's very specific to preparing for GCSE, in this case, AQA single biology foundation level. It's a 6-point question from a paper, I forget which year. Notice how the dictogloss text practices and reinforces both the key vocabulary, like cell, nucleus, embryo, and also the passive voice. It is taken, it is discarded, it can be removed. So the learners are practicing key vocabulary and grammar in a very specific context. In preparation for this activity, a teacher might have drawn attention to the key vocabulary, encouraging translated glossaries to be completed, so learners with EAL can have translated words to help them and to keep in mind while they're doing the activity. The teacher may have drawn attention to the passive voice structure, is removed, is cultured, etc., and emphasised how this structure can give an academic and scientific tone to a text. As they complete the activity, students will reinforce and practice both the vocabulary and the structures, as well as getting an example of a model answer. So let's consider how this works in practice. How does what we've looked at, the strategies we've looked at, how do they apply to one of our case studies from earlier? So Leah has had full schooling in Ukraine, so there's no need for any SEND groups unless we happen to know or becomes apparent that she has a SEND such as dyslexia. She needs to be in middle or upper ability groups where the cognitive challenge is kept high and where there are good role models for behaviour and for language, because new arrivals will tend to copy what they see and hear. When she's had time to settle, conduct a proficiency in English assessment, such as the Bell Foundation one, and start to track her progress in English language acquisition. Leah would benefit from being taught by teachers who are familiar with EAL pedagogy and know how to include EAL learners in their lesson in a way which maximises their English language acquisition as well as their subject knowledge. This might include the use of scaffolded writing and reading and speaking activities such as closed sentence stems, substitution tables, and the strategies that we've just been looking at. Leah will also benefit from careful modelling of both written and spoken English, for example, through dictogloss. She'll benefit from teachers who appreciate that her first language is key to her learning and who encourage her to draw on it. She needs to sit with peers who are sympathetic and kind and who share her first language if possible, but if not, who are kind and helpful to her. And outside of the mainstream class, study groups can be very beneficial. This is when groups of children from the same year group, perhaps speaking the same language, meet to discuss what they've learnt in the week and to go over any problems they've had. This could be as part of a homework club. Leah's mother would probably be pleased to be able to help too. So having translated curriculum outlines sent home along with clear homework guidelines would be useful for them. And then outside of the school, Leah would benefit from attending Ukrainian supplementary schools if there are any available. So Leah, who we've just been talking about, she's in Key Stage 3. Our other case study, Jonas, is in Key Stage 4, however, and new arrivals at Key Stage 4 using EAL can be quite a challenge, especially if their English language proficiency is low and or they've had disrupted education leading to poor literacy levels and lack of school experience. As with all EAL students, no two are ever the same, so it's important to consider each individual separately. But a good place to start is by consulting the learner. What does the learner want to do? Do they have career aspirations? Which subjects did they enjoy most in previous schooling? Then consider what resources the school actually has available, and then use these to construct a personalised Key Stage 4 timetable with the learner and parents involved in the planning if possible. Bear in mind, though, that both the learner and parents may not be familiar with the UK education and exam system, so you may want to use the guidance that the Bell Foundation has. A full GCSE timetable is challenging for many first language English students, and it might be too much for some new arrivals with EAL, especially if their proficiency in English is low or their education has been sporadic. So constructing a Key Stage 4 timetable for a new EL arrival, you may want to consider dedicating an option slot to ongoing EAL provision of some kind. This could be delivered by a suitably qualified teacher or HLTA, and ideally would teach English language through the medium of curriculum content, thus helping the learner to better access his or her mainstream classes. It's also a good, safe place to practice speaking skills, especially for shy students. Some schools provide study support slots where students use the time to consolidate and process work from other subjects, In general, it's best to avoid placing the new arrival in lower ability or SEND groups unless there's a known SEND. And if you're a teacher of a GCSE class and you've got a new EAL arrival in your class, know this. In your class, they're acquiring English alongside curriculum content. They're doing a double job, and so are you. And GCSE success just might come later. It might come at college or at sixth form. The job you're doing, though, in enabling them to learn English through your subject is no less valid if they're not able to reach a high enough level of proficiency to pass GCSE in the short time they have available. The English skills and subject knowledge developed in your class with your help will still be with them for life. So, in their book, which is called Refugee Education, Theorising Practice in Schools, Joanna McIntyre and Fran Abrahams recount that in a case study school, GCSE examination performance was positively impacted by the inclusion of learners taking GCSEs in their home languages. And these language GCSEs often exist in two specifications. There are those designed to be taken by first language English speakers, such as regular GCSE French that you or I took. And these exams tend to be ridiculously easy for a native French speaker, except possibly for understanding the English instructions. And then there are those GCSEs designed to be taken by first language speakers. So Edexcel, Pearson and Cambridge have a number of first language IGCSE exams available, including Arabic, including Mandarin Chinese, including Greek, French, Turkish and Portuguese, and some others too. These are designed for native speakers of those languages and would test the learner at a much higher level than foreign language IGCSEs, which typically only require learners to reach level A2. Having said that, for learners with significantly disrupted educations, then possibly the foreign language exam would be easier. But for those with a good level of first language proficiency and literacy, then the first language exams are much more meaningful, and preparing for them will enhance their language development in both English and their first language. There's also English as a second language IGCSE, which can be taught as a GCSE option, and it's quite old-fashioned in its style. It's reading comprehension, an essay, that kind of thing, a multiple choice, and I think the Cambridge one has a speaking element too. You might want to consider alternatives to GCSE. So Step Up to English from AQA is a qualification that can run alongside or instead of GCSE English language. It's progressive, it's bronze, silver, gold progression, and it's good because students practice the same skills needed at GCSE. So it's useful preparation for perhaps sitting or resitting GCSE at college or sixth form next year or the year after. And from this point of view, I would recommend it as being better than the functional skills exam. So it may be that the time a Key Stage 4 new arrival spends in school is best viewed as an essential ground-laying preparation for moving on to college or further education provision, laying a foundation to prepare for success later on. It can be really helpful to forge strong links with your local FE provider and find out what they can offer your learners next year or the year after. Visiting the college with the learner, familiarising them with it and talking about possible options can give them a sense of purpose and something to aim for. Their time at school is then seen as a time to prepare for this and to settle into their new country, acquire English, both social and academic, computer skills, literacy as needed, and become good enough to enter college. Some colleges run access courses, some colleges run intensive GCSE resits, which might be appropriate, or there are work-orientated courses available. Again, the key is to consult the learner about what he or she wants to do. So now we're going to think about how this might work in relation to our Key Stage 4 case study, Jonas. Now, Jonas is unaccompanied, he's a separated child. Therefore, it will be important to meet and work with the foster family or the care agency going forward. Jonas has had a very disrupted education through no fault of his own, and for this reason, his literacy is limited. So although the temptation might be here to assign him to lower ability groups, because after all, they're smaller and the work's geared for students with weaker literacy skills, care should be taken that he's not disadvantaged as a result, because we currently have no knowledge of his cognitive ability, and it might be higher than average, in which case lower ability groups would disadvantage him. It may be that Jonas is put in a catch-up group to develop his literacy and his language skills in English. Maybe one or more of his options is used for that, but that shouldn't mean that he's put in lower ability groups across all subjects. Also, in any one-to-one or small group sessions which your school might provide, it's very important not to use childish pictures or reading schemes designed for much younger children, as these can be demotivating and undermine self-esteem. You might want to consider giving Jonas one or two fewer GCSE options and using the extra slots for some kind of subject-focused language support. He might be able to take Arabic GCSE. The tutor would be able to ascertain this. In his mainstream lessons, however, he'll need scaffolded, language-friendly activities, similar to the ones we've just been looking at. Links with local community language schools might also help him. They might help him develop his Arabic. They might help him make friends. As he has aspirations to be a paramedic, it's worth exploring any possible relevant work experience options. Or does the school run first aid courses for students, or if these are available at a college locally, this may be a way in which he can make friends, improve his English, and pursue his aspirations. So links with further education providers will help give him a sense of purpose and a sense of direction. So for the last section, we're going to look at working with parents and carers. So again, the same message: parents and carers of refugees and asylum-seeking children are a super diverse group, but they're often said to be a hard group to reach. It's important not to generalise, but there are some things here that you may want to bear in mind. Firstly, parents and carers of refugee children have been through a lot. They've been through everything their children have been through, and they've probably been through a bit more as they've protected their children as much as possible. Parents may be suffering from the effects of trauma themselves, whilst also trying to care for traumatised children. And in some cultures, there's a taboo surrounding mental health, and parents might not seek help. They're in an unfamiliar culture. The customs and school system here may be very strange to them, and certain cultural events that we are so used to, such as birthday parties, cakes, sleepovers, may seem alien to them. They may not want their children to join in, and this can lead to tension between them and the children, who usually want to fit in. Parents seeking asylum can feel isolated. This is compounded in some cases by their not being allowed to work, and often, but not always, living in poverty. Our case study, Leah, being Ukrainian and living with a host family, may be living quite comfortably, but Jonas, living with a foster family, there's a big question mark over whether he'll be allowed to work in the future. So there's also a drop in perceived status from working to not working, or from being in a professional role to an unskilled one, from living in a comfortable home to a hostel. All these things can be, as you can imagine, very stressful and disempowering. Unaccompanied asylum seekers, such as Jonas, who are usually older teenagers, and they're usually boys, but not always, they may be cared for by foster carers or in residential care homes. Make sure that the carers are briefed in how best to support them in their schoolwork and English language acquisition, and on the importance of maintaining their first language, which the carers may well not share. Also, if they go down on the school information as coming from a household where English is spoken, they may not be eligible for the extra time at GCSE. So it's worth writing to the exam board and making the case for that, because there is a precedent where it has been allowed. So some things that schools can actually do. The most important thing schools can do, obviously, is to help parents, is to keep their children safe and to keep their children happy and to keep their children learning. Parents need to feel that they're an important and valued part of the school community, and they won't necessarily instinctively feel that. So make them welcome, listen to them. This may entail arranging parents' evenings where they can meet each other, as well as having an introduction to the school and how it works, and perhaps an overview of the UK system when they first arrive. Interpreters will be very useful. Better still if there are members of staff from the same community in the school or who speak the parents' language. Providing translations of key documents such as uniform policies, homework policy, curriculum outlines, etc., will make parents feel more involved and less isolated. And then this in turn results in better outcomes for their children. Some schools are able to host ESOL lessons, even provide them on site for parents who need them. If this is possible, then that's fantastic. And a creche is very, very useful. You'll get more parents attending if you can provide childcare. If this isn't a possibility, however, find out where local free lessons are taking place and signpost them. Also, make contact with local refugee support services and maybe invite them into the school. Some strategies that have been used successfully by schools include these. So, getting parents involved in school events, such as shows, assemblies, and sporting events. One school invited parents in and involved parents in making props and costumes for a musical performance in which some of their children featured. Another school issued special translated invitations to Sports Day and asked a parent who had previously been a gymnast to give out medals. There are also opportunities for parental involvement in festival celebrations. Some schools have appointed parent ambassadors to help welcome new parents into the school, and perhaps to run coffee mornings or chatter groups in which parents can network, ask questions, and voice concerns or opinions, which the ambassadors can then duly feed back to the school. Parents also welcome advice on how to support their children's learning in home, including the maintenance and development of their home language. Very important is to make parents' evenings and option evenings for Key Stage 4 and 5 accessible through provision of interpreters. This will make a big difference. And finally, opening the school to community groups, whether that's Saturday schools or Saturday language schools or community groups set up to offer refugee support, is another way to build links with the community and enable new parents to meet each other. So to finish, I'd just like to share the results of a pupil focus group, which was run by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. They asked this focus group of pupils what they valued most in their new schools. The pupils were all pupils who had arrived as new to English pupils in the UK schools. So they asked them, what do you value most? And the results were all the things they'd feared they wouldn't receive. If you think back to Emily's slide at the beginning, the fears and hopes that new arrivals would have about starting schools, friendship, kindness, and acceptance. So pupils said in this focus group that making friends was the fastest way to feel happy and safe in school. So mentoring and buddy schemes were seen as helpful, also clubs and extracurricular activities being made accessible to them. They commonly reported, you'll be pleased to know, that they found teachers kind and helpful, and they attached great importance to being able to ask for help with class or homework. There was also a strong message from the focus group that pupils really valued and appreciated being able to use and develop their mother tongue without being mocked or laughed at or told not to. Pupils also recognised the importance of becoming proficient in English in order to fit in and progress with their education. Many pupils mentioned particular members of staff by name, either those who'd helped with English language learning or members of staff who could speak to them in their home language. So the message to schools from children is clear. Welcome them in all their diversity, help them to become part of the school community and value what they contribute to it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Emily. It was a really, really fantastic presentation, and there's been some really great feedback coming in already. We've run over, so we don't have time to take questions, but I think a lot of them have actually been answered in the presentation, and we will include any other answers when we send out the links. So you will get a recording, link to the recording tomorrow, together with all of the links and any specific answers. And we're hearing you loud and clear, Scotland. Thanks ever so much for attending. Just to let you know that we do have a course coming up in September that's specifically on working with students who are new arrivals. So if you could just move that slide forward, that'd be great. Thank you. So yeah, the course in September on new arrivals, and then on the next slide we've also got a course on leading a whole school strategy. If you're interested in moving this beyond new arrivals, and perhaps you're an EAL coordinator, or you think that somebody in your school from SLT would be interested, we have Leading a Whole School Strategy, which is a really, really fabulous course for bringing in a top-down approach to EAL. Thanks ever so much. Have a lovely evening. I hope the weather has improved. Thanks ever so much. Goodbye.
Thanks again. Bye.
Bye, everybody.